Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thank you, and I hope you're enjoying life. What I'm thinking about this morning has been the relationship today with what's been going on in the last 200 years in the Western world with colonialism and how the consequences of colonialism are still, in fact, affecting us. And I don't want to appear to be saying anything against colonialism because it had a lot of good effects as well. And after all, the same sort of thing has been going on ever since the beginning of empires, which really began, 4,000 odd years ago.
Hmm.
So it's certainly not something new. However, since the world continues to change, and probably changing faster and faster, the effects may not be the same today as they were in the past. And if we go back to the end of the 19th century, when there was that conference in Berlin, when the major governments of the major empires met together and decided how to divide the world up amongst themselves, that was roughly the same time that there began to be a series of movements in a number of countries that had been under the British Empire and also to some extent under other empires, rebelling against
The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs.
yeah, rebelling against the imposition of a foreign social order.
Hmm.
And what I'm arguing is that that was the beginning of terrorism. That I mean, we've said before, and many people have said that what's going on now in Afghanistan and northern Pakistan is a rebellion against what happened. That is the intrusion into an Islamic society of Western values.
Hmm.
But there's not much discussion of how that intrusion began and what caused it. But after all, there were similar movements. Movements began in the 19th century, and they began not only in India, but also in later in Africa, in Kenya, and in West Africa,
Hmm.
and also in other parts of the world. And the thing is that people became accustomed in these countries before the end of the colonial period to the idea of rebelling against the imposition of a social order which was not their own.
Let me just jump in a second. Let me ask you a question. Everything you've said so far, I understand and I agree with. But if we wound the clock back, say 2,000 years, and looked at Roman colonies and Greek colonies, was there a similar dynamic that was going on to your interpretation? Were people rebelling against Athens or people rebelling against Rome and colonies throughout the Mediterranean or in Northern Africa?
I think it would be possible to develop an argument along those lines, but it's much more difficult because we have so much less information. But there were certainly some rebellions in the ancient world.
Well, what I'm thinking about is that even 200 years ago, there had long been the appearance of newspapers, of mass writing, broadsides. As time went on, there was the appearance of telegraph. There were sailing ships. Communications between London and the New World, for example, took 6 weeks, which is not an unbelievably long time, considering what the alternative was just 200 years earlier. So you could probably trace some growth of globalization and probably look at the increased reactionary kind of movement going on in colonies.
Absolutely, and the point is that everything's on a larger scale now than it was. Began to be on a larger scale in the late 19th century than it had been before,
Hmm.
and now, though we're thinking on a larger scale, these things are not going on a global scale, but they're going on as a result of what happened on a global scale before in a number of different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's not only the problems in Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, it's also, I think, when in a number of different parts of the world, and even to some extent similar things in our own society, that people are rebelling against a social order that they feel they don't fit into. So when somebody walks into a shopping mall in a town south of Birmingham, Alabama, and starts shooting people, it's very difficult to work out why they're doing it. And there's been a lot of discussion of this, and a lot of people feel we just don't understand it. But these are people that for some reason are not fitting in to the society as they know it. And I mean, one of the problems with the success of psychology and psychiatry over the last 100 years is that it's assumed that everything goes on in the brain, but it's in fact what's going on in society that is causing these problems. So yes, the psychiatrists can help us deal perhaps with each of us with our own individual social situations, but it's not the brain that manages it so much as the social situation which controls the brain. I mean, I've been trying to get people for some time to work with me to try to understand just exactly how social context affects the way the brain works. But it's very difficult to do because the people who study the brain have completely different research methodologies from people who study the social relationships, and it's difficult to put them together. Yeah. However, I think that it's a problem that's going to be with us in different forms for a long time, because after all, the rate of social change is increasing, and we're expecting that we're going to finish up being a global community of 10 billion or more people, and we have no idea what that's going to be like in social terms, because we're still divided up into nation states, most of which are not really nations, and have problems like this to begin with.
Well, let me ask you a question. There are not too many colonies around these days in 2018, and there haven't been for a while. Is there still a hangover from the colonial era, do you think, affecting terrorist activity?
I think the reason I brought colonialism in was I think that it was during the last 100 years of colonialism that people in many parts of the world got used to the idea that you can rebel against the government.
Mm-hmm. Which has probably, now only been empowered by the increasing velocity and the rate of globalization, right? Because
yeah, I mean, indiscriminate violence, I think, which is the trademark of terrorism, really began in that last 100 years of the colonial period. That's what I'm suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
Before then, there was plenty of violence and plenty of rebellion, but it was not indiscriminate violence. It was directed against particular people. So I think that our problem in the modern world, with the increasing rate of social change and the increasing size of the arenas in which we interact with each other, is the indiscriminacy that has developed in the way rebellion against the social situation has developed.
Well, that's a very negative situation, because what it does is it doesn't advance the cause of the people who are it doesn't advance the cause of the. I'm just gonna carry through. This will stop shortly. Just a minute.
I hope that's not a terrorist incident in the background.
No, it's not. The indiscrimination, whatever the right word is on a Sunday morning, the indiscriminate nature of that activity does not advance the cause that the actor is trying to promote. In fact, what it does is it provokes a backlash. Invariably, it provokes a backlash. And you would think, I mean, there's a succession of these acts that go on every month, at least. You would think that somebody who's thinking of causing an indiscriminate act of terror would have gotten the message by now that, well, wait a minute, maybe this does not promote the cause that I'm trying to promote. But it doesn't seem to happen that way. It just...
Well, I'm an optimist, so I assume that things will work out sooner or later in a much better way. But the reason that the people who are doing these things are not trying to achieve something particularly, they're reacting against a personal situation, I think. The question is how long it's going to take us to understand that something has to be done about the way society is organized, and to develop something better than a nation state. The thing is that of the 195 nation states we have in the world at the moment, I'm not sure what proportion, but a very large proportion were developed from the outside, not from the inside.
Of course. Yeah, yeah.
Most of the people on the inside feel out of place.
Can I gently switch gears? The G20 session just wrapped up in South America with a call for multilateralism, I might add. That was included in the official communique. That was not blocked by the United States. In fact, the official communique was agreed to, and there were only two sticking points that the United States blocked, and that was the efficacy of the World Trade Organization, and of course the Paris Climate Accords, where the United States still maintained its right to go its own way, despite the fact that the American government just 10 days ago released a report indicating that climate change was already a cooked goose, so to speak, and that we were heading down the road to perdition and damnation. But nevertheless, I just found it fascinating that for whatever reasons, domestic political causes or what, it seems as if the ship is slowly righting itself again on a global scale.
For the climate change, you mean?
Well,
or just in general?
In general, insofar as multilateralism and an understanding that perhaps this tariff route is not the right way to go, that there's international cooperation is the future, and this idea of striking out nationalistically on respective individual nation-state scales is not something that's going to be embraced by the G20. That it was a little bit of a firm message sent back.
But I thought there was only one member of the G20 who was thinking in those terms.
This is indeed true, but there was I was surprised that the message was as forceful as it was back to that one member. That, okay, you can have a tantrum, you can try to not sign the communique, you can do whatever you wish, but we're sticking to the script here. I was happy to see that.
Well, yes. And I agree entirely, but I'm also puzzled about the reception that MBS got there.
Well, I only saw the handshake with Putin. I saw Macron jabbing his finger into his chest, lecturing him. I saw other people giving him the cold shoulder a little bit. But I agree. It was I'm not so sure I would have even been photographed in the same picture with him.
And there was a long article in the news this morning, and I'm not sure now where it originated, analyzing what's been going on in Saudi Arabia as something that is the current stage of a really serious fight within the royal family that started some time ago.
Yeah, I've seen similar articles. Yes, yeah.
So this is, I think, is another nation-state problem,
Mm-hmm.
that We see it looks different simply because it's a very different a nation state that has become organized in a very different way. But it's another of these problems of just exactly how you put together a government for a certain territory and certain population. And there's only a very small number of the countries in the world where the government is organized from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
And Saudi Arabia is not one of them. No. You and I have often talked about Saudi Arabia back during the times of the Arab Spring, when it looked as if Saudi Arabia too was possibly going to be impacted by this. And and I think that's what the fight within the House of Saud is about. There's a level of recognition on the part of some family members that, well, wait a minute, inevitably this is what's going to happen unless we take some corrective moves. And I think the West had thought that MBS might have been the one to make those corrective moves, but instead he's turned out to be a little bit of a unpredictable force.
Yeah.
Very interesting. We'll have to think about this.
Okay.
All right, Professor Spooner, a pleasure as always. We'll look forward to next week.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Bye.